Hello, everyone. Oh, I've been so excited about connecting with you all with this. Great.
Hi,
Can you?
Jacqui.
Hi, Susan. Happy birthday, gorgeous. Lovely to see you, Leanne. A few new faces. I'm not sure of Jordan and Brittany. And oh, great. And I finally get to meet you. Is it Loki? I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name correctly. Loki? No, oh, you can't hear me? Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Oh, good.
I can too.
Fantastic. Okay, I will just keep admitting people for a little while. And you're welcome to either put everybody on gallery view, just so you can see all these beautiful faces, all of these story-loving people coming in. Right, Tracy, hello. Oh, there we go. Carol. Fantastic. I'll just pop you on mute for the moment. Listen, hello.
Hello.
Good to see you. Okay. Oh, now this is the moment. If we were live, I'd say, now have you got a cup of tea, and we'll just have a little chat for a moment. So if you get yourselves comfortable in whatever way you'll be comfortable, seatbelts off. Etty, hello. Great. Okay. Right. Oh, people are coming in thick and fast. Etty and Judy, hello. Okay. All right. There might be a few more coming in. So just be prepared for a few more little bees flying into our hive here. And welcome, everybody. This is just absolutely delicious to see you all. There we go. Whoops, there's another one. I know why people have technical assistance. There we go. Great. That's it. My name's Jacqui Bushell, and some of you, I recognize your beautiful faces, and some I know quite well. And it's just really gorgeous to see you all. And whoops, sorry, I'll just keep, everyone will be here in just a moment. That's it. Just beautiful to see you all. And we're going to have an hour and a little bit. I'm aware that the times were a bit juggled on a couple of the messages out to you. So what I'd love to do is chat with you for, say, an hour, and then, okay, just bring in a few more people. I can't believe how many people are coming in. This is just so exciting. And what I'd love to talk about today as well, if we can just do a stretch time thing and have you all day, so we can have several cups of tea and lunch together and a chat, and then to talk about why fairy tales are still so relevant and why they're so resonant, and what it is that they touch in us and what it is that we can touch through them, why they're still so potent and have such resonance and such power. So there's probably at least a dozen talks that I'd love to do, which is sort of compounding into one very brief hour here. So what I'd love to do is I'm going to have a little bit of a chat today about some definitions and about a little bit about where fairy tales come from, a few key people, and a few of the weird, strange, and fabulous politics and subversiveness and the juiciness of them as well. So, excuse me for my eyes just constantly flicking over to the side here as I'm admitting people everywhere. What I'd like to do is to invite you to come in a little closer to the fireplace. Come in and around the hearth and imagine that you're getting yourself comfortable and that maybe it's nighttime. Maybe there's a forest out there or a desert. And just come into a place where there's a moment of quiet in yourself. A moment of stillness. You know that pause that happens just before you're about to hear a story? And there's that, a slight shift from one realm to another, because that's one of the things that stories do, is that they bridge worlds for us. And they bridge us into worlds of possibility and magic and wonder, new perspectives, new allies. So if you allow that breath into yourself, and if you allow the breath of the world into you. So if you have a little stretch and a breath. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful courtesan, a Greek courtesan, and oh, she was lovely. Her skin was the color of golden honey, and her hair was ebony and lustrous, the color of Kalamata olives. And she was bathing in a river one day, and what happened was that an eagle flew down and it picked up one of her slippers that she'd sewn herself, which was on a rock where she'd placed it before she dived into the river. And the eagle picked it up and it flew off with it. And it flew over lands and it flew over countries until it flew over the land of Egypt and over the city of Memphis. And it dropped the slipper and it fell onto the lap of the great king, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he looked at this slipper and he thought, oh, this must be a sign from the gods. Where is this slipper from? So then he searched high and low for the maiden whose foot would fit into the slipper and couldn't find her. And I'm sure you kind of have an idea of where this story might be going until finally somebody said, oh, it might just belong to the courtesan Rhodopsis. She's in Greece. So he found her, and then she was raised from her lowly station and became the wife of the Pharaoh. So this is one of the earliest versions of Cinderella, and it was written down by Herodotus in 500 BC. And stories have been told orally for so long. We can trace them back about 6,000 years. 6,000 years back into the early dawn of the Bronze Age. And that Cinderella story, there are so many versions. Just in Europe alone, there's about 400 versions. Around the world, people have collated maybe 700 versions of that story, which has the same classic motifs of a woman in some kind of oppression who does a massive social rising thing, plus or minus a slipper being involved. So in China, there was another one in the 800s where there was a young Chinese woman who had a beautiful gowns that were made for her. She went off, found some great Chinese lord, lost a slipper, and she was the only one who would actually fit this little beautifully stitched slipper because she was the only one with the smallest foot-bound feet. Because you can't take any of the fairy tales out of the culture, out of the society in which they were told in. So the motifs will carry on because there's so many universal themes that they relate to, like being socially mobile, like a rags to riches story, or riches to rags to riches story, or coming of age, all those themes and the emotions of them. I mean, my goodness, do fairy tales teach us so much about dysfunctional families? I mean, really? We'll talk about that a bit later as well. So after China, let's see, if we jump forward 1,000 years or so, and we come to, there was a story of Cinderella through the Arabian Nights. There was a story of Cinderella that was written down by French women authors in the 1600s. They made theirs a little more subversive with a really shrewd, cunning heroine. And then things started getting a lot more moralistic, and Charles Perrault's Cinderella started becoming pretty dreary. And then we had the Grimms, who made it a little bit different again and brought in Protestantization and morals and German nationalism. And we'll chat about how some of these things shifted and changed as well over the centuries. And then we had Disney and Disney's version of Cinderella. So let's see. So if actually one of the interesting things with what Walt Disney did, and I have so many issues, and I'm sure just about everybody has had a few issues with what Disney did with sentimentality and nostalgia and politics and gender and race politics. I mean, they've got a little bit more politically savvy these days. But Walt Disney actually believed that his 1950s Cinderella was a progressive woman because she had a dream and she hung on to it, which was one of the great underlying themes, which is really infused, I know, in America ideology and in Australia as well. Have a dream and follow it and it'll come true. Anybody can rise. You just need to have discipline, perseverance, and a singing, talking animal, and it'll be okay. So we'll also come back to Disney as well a bit later. So I guess one of there's so many questions that have really come to me about where fairy tales actually originate from. So, and what they actually are, how we define them, because the word fairy tale really only came into being in a very, very specific way from Marie Catherine, Countess d'Aulnay, in the late 1600s, in 1697 in France. And she called these fantastical, subversive, political, feminist stories that she was writing, along with a whole bunch of other French aristocratic women. She called them contes de fées, fairy tales, because they actually had a whole lot of fairies in them. And she used fairies for a really particular reason. And then somehow or other, by about 1750, the word fairy tale actually began sticking and referring to a whole particular genre. Most of them didn't have fairies in them, but the phrase kind of stuck anyway. So for today, I'll just keep using the word fairy tale to refer to the whole gamut of them. So one of the things with these kind of stories, because they originate in the oral tradition and they go way back, and because they cross so many cultures, like coming back to Cinderella, for example, there's Cinderella type stories everywhere through Europe, through Iran, through India, through Greece, through Asia. And it makes me wonder a lot more about universal archetypes and themes, and that they arise spontaneously in places. And maybe there's also particular times in the world where there's archetypal energies that seem to arise, that seem to come into being. I mean, you can always, if you look at art or listen to music, you can tell instantly whether that's medieval music or Renaissance or Baroque music or 1970s boy band pop music. You can tell instantly from hearing it or seeing the type of art and how it's depicted. So same thing, I feel like with stories, is that there's particular themes that bubble up in the collective consciousness and come in to be expressed and revealed. And that's also why I'm really excited about what's possible with fairy tales today, because there's no really clear borderland between a fairy tale and a myth. So many of the stories, we can actually trace them back to mythic origins, like Cupid and Psyche, for instance, at the Greek myth. And that traces back to older and older stories as well. But that actually is carried through with all the Beauty and the Beast stories. And there's so many of those, animal bridegroom or animal brides. Actually, one of the things that I just adore, that I think is really so delicious about fairy tales and why they're also so important now, is that they bring us into, not only do they bring us into enchantment and bring us into a world where magic isn't even questioned. I mean, have you ever read a fairy tale where somebody jumps back in shock of, oh my goodness, that cricket or that cockroach or that creature just talked to me? No, they just go, oh yeah, there's ants doing things for me. There's a mouse that's talking to me. There's a cat who's wearing pants and boots. It's just automatic. It's fine. Oh yeah, some big magic happened. Yeah, we go off to the witch in the woods and she does something. There's gold that there's this easy acceptance, a naturalness with enchantment. And I love how that brings us into crossing a world, crossing into the mythopoetic realms of the other world. Fairy tales are shamanic. They help us bridge places. And what I think is so important as well is that they bring us into a direct relationship with nature. They're a way of offsetting that what came in with the so-called Enlightenment and logic, scientific rationalism, is that disconnection. It brings us into a direct rapport with the land. Because one of the things with fairy tales is you can't take the nature, you can't take the landscape out of them. And with any oral tale, they're rooted in the landscape. If you go to any Indigenous culture, they'll tell you a story and it's related with the ancestors, with that tree, with that story, with that place. And then when you bring in these universal themes, these motifs, glass mountains, slippers, children wearing red cloaks, going into a well and into the underworld, climbing into a tree and reaching another realm. I mean, they're so shamanic. Then they have the universal aspect, or what's called a trope, so a key theme, and then they're individualized. They're put into the land and then they're claimed. I've just been listening to a whole bunch of stories which are based around, say, the Rumpelstiltskin theme, where there's a woman who's in trouble and some little magical helper comes in who then says, I'm going to take your child unless you guess my name. That's just a really, really common theme. And I was hearing stories from Wales where it was based in such and such a farm up the road, where it came from Germany, where it came from Scandinavia. And there were things that rooted it in the land, which brought it into a time and a place. We claim them and we make them our own. So let me come on back to, actually, I'm going to share screen and then have a bit more of a, here we go. All right, can you see that okay? Is that coming up? Great. Okay, so actually what I'll start with first of all is, if you just have a think about your favorite fairy tales and pop some up in the chat, which ones that you love or which ones that you absolutely can't stand. I know I've got a real love-hate relationship with Red Riding Hood. And that's basically because Charles Perrault, we'll get to him in a moment, he brought in this whole moralistic, nasty virtue that was basically if you're promiscuous, you'll end up dead. And that's okay because you're bad. And that there's really radical earlier versions of Red Riding Hood, which are just so rooted in pagan symbolism. They're earthy and it's an underworld journey. So if you think about which ones have stuck with you, and I mean, really, if you think about it, if you said to anybody, Three Little Pigs, you'd kind of get a house blowing down scenario. If you said Princess in a Tower, you'd automatically think of several stories. Sleeping Beauty, they're so anchored in our psyche. And one of the things that's also a little bit tricky is that thank you Walt Disney and thank you Grimm Brothers, we seem to have this idea of a standardized version. Kids these days say, oh, I know what happens to Ariel, the Little Mermaid. Actually, I'm just trying to think of the Disney version because I'm steeped in Hans Christian Andersen, who brought in a whole lot of other morals as well, where she had to die in order to get a soul, because of course a mermaid can't have a soul. And there were different motives around freedom that Walt Disney brought in. So we have this idea of a standardized or set or an original tale, the true version. And there is no true version, I guess, is one of the key things that I'd really like to get across. So let's have a quick look at what the difference is between folk tales and legends and myths, and then have a little look at what fairy tales actually are. So, okay, so basically a myth, let me move these little things, is a myth is rooted in the timeless. It's rooted in the sacred. It's often about the origin of the worlds or a creation story or some way of explaining how the world is. And it's set in a place or in a time that is outside ordinary human time. It's in some kind of big time, primordial time. So they're kind of larger, broader narratives that explain these divine or semi-divine beings and their actions, and then humans, how they relate to them, or what it is that these divine or semi-divine beings are teaching us. So they're bigger stories that are rooted in universal truths and within the sacred. So themes of them also track through other into folk tales as well. So legends. Now, a legend is sort of kind of maybe rooted in something that could sort of kind of maybe be true. Basically, they're thought to be historical, kind of, but not authenticated. There's been so much debate about King Arthur, for instance, as well as a lot of debate about Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad, about did Troy actually exist? Was there a 10-year war there? There's legends around Atlantis and Loch Ness, for instance, or the Headless Horseman, or that are meant to be true. Basically, a legend is something that is anchored somewhere in time and in a place. Now, a fairy tale, they're also called, well, folk tales or Marchen tales, which means wonder tale, because they are wonderful, literally. So what they do, to look at a couple of different definitions, basically one of my favorite definitions is by J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien says, well, you know a fairy tale because you just know a fairy tale, basically because you feel it in your gut, and there's an atmosphere and there's a mood to them, and you just kind of know, which is very, very vague, but it opens it up into a rich felt sense of them. So a little bit more of a a standard definition is that they're a fictional story or a wonder tale with a succession of motifs or particular themes, like knight in shining armor is can relate to love, or beautiful sister, ugly sister, that sort of thing. So that they're based in some kind of supernatural or enchanted world, no particular time, no particular locality. They're rooted in once upon a time. Now, the other thing is that they're often thought of to be for children. And this is a real real misconception, because they actually only came in for children per se, as a being marketed specifically for children in the 19th century. That was when there was a middle class that was rising, industrialization was really rising, and so was nationalism. And there started to be a lot more questions around what childhood actually is, and a lot of debates about educating children, not just rich children, aristocratic children, but all children, because it actually took really until maybe even the early 20th century before this idea of you shouldn't educate the peasants because they'll want to rise above themselves. And coming back to the subversiveness of fairy tales is that so many of them were about rising up socially, coming up to marrying a peasant, marrying a king or queen, marrying a princess and then becoming a king or queen, or coming into sudden wealth. So in fairy tales, there's often like a particular search or a quest. The characters are simple, they're archetypal. There's a few really key things with them, in that they're linear in how they're told. They're quite flat. They don't have a lot of emotion in them. So it's like, oh yes, the mother killed the child and fed the child to her youngest daughter, and then the bird flew off. It's like nobody jumps up or down. The child who ends up eating her brother, it's like, oh yeah, whatever. So there's this sort of flat emotional effect to them. It's very, very matter of fact. And I find just extraordinary and delicious at the same time. So they're flat. There's a sort of, I guess, key themes in them, as I was saying before, about dysfunctional families. I mean, what a teaching aid, what a wisdom or medicine story aid, to have all of these stories of, oh, this is what might happen if you've got a mother, father, sister, brother, stepmother like that. This is one way that you could deal with jealousy, resentment, hate, love. This is what happens if you're kind. This is what happens if you're loving. One of the things I just love about these stories is, in essence, they're about relationships, and they really promote compassion and kindness and love. I mean, there are a few really dodgy politics in there here and there, but ultimately that's the bottom line. And then these days we've got a whole lot of other questioning around some of the sub-themes. You'll only be a good, kind, loving person if you're beautiful or become beautiful because of enchantment, or lose an enchantment, and if you're white. And if you've got a talking animal. So, but they bring in, just coming into another definition from Jennifer Shacker and Jones, is the idea of a fairy tale can be better understood as an open-ended, playful way of engaging social and political issues in a format that defies the constraints of realist fiction, rather than in a fixed discursive form that responds to a set of narrative rules. Basically, it's saying fantasy, sci-fi is a brilliant way of getting people to be able to be more playful and coming up with creative options. If you made it realistic, people would get bogged down in the details. Bring in fantasy and The world is literally your oyster or your fairy or your singing cricket. So and what they're also teaching us is that for I don't know how many millennia, is that we've had a relationship with the other world through dreams, through journeying, through our imagination, and that this has been known and cultivated. One of the earliest, I guess, fairy kind of tales that was jotted down, well, in sort of jotted down in European tales is a story 6,000 years ago of the smith and the demon, and a blacksmith who sold his soul to some kind of demonic force in order to be able to have lots of riches, and then how he outwitted this nasty energy. Other ones, 4,500 years ago, a boy steals an ogre's treasure. I mean, these themes just have kept going. So 4,500 years ago, the boy trespasses into a giant's house, hides in the house, evades the giant hunting for him, kills the giant, and then escapes with the treasure. 3,000 years ago, there were animal bridegroom stories. 3,000 years ago, a peasant was teaching his daughter how to, with the help of some little being, how to spin gold from straw. And we can track these old tales now through linguistic patterns. Okay, so another definition: folklore is an expressive body of culture shared by a particular group of people. It encompasses the traditions common to that culture, subcultural group, and it includes oral tradition. It's just kind of really hard to define specifically what they actually are, because fairy tales are kind of a genre of folk tales and a genre of literature, and it all just gets really vague. One thing that I'll just mention, just briefly, a couple of fairy tale or folk tale theory things, just so you're on board with it here, is a motif. These are based on ways of classifying fairy tales. Seeing there's so many, how do we work out what's what and who's from where and how? So a motif is a recurring or a key theme, or could be a word or creatures or a particular setting. So like a magical helper comes in, mice, rats, donkeys, birds, talking animals, the triumph of the poor person or the foolish person, the youngest who's considered to be silly versus the oldest who's mean, beautiful compared to ugly, impossible tasks, and repetitive phrases, fee, fi, fo, fum, those sorts of things. So they're within a story that also might cross different stories. And the other key word is what's called a trope. And a trope is what occurs across a whole genre or a type of literature where there's really commonly identified plot features like animal bridegroom, animal bride, persecuted heroine. So for example, rescue by a sister is number 311 in a particular classification system, which was set up in 1910 by Auntie Anne. And then it was sort of redone a bit by Stith Thompson in 1926, and then in the 2000s by someone else. So they came up with a whole system of mapping out hundreds of these tropes, giving them all a number, and then slotting every single fairy tale that they came across into those numbers. So if you look up, for example, 311, you'll come up with every story about sisters rescuing each other, or every story with animal bridegrooms. So, but it's also a little bit problematic because they brought in their biases. We've decided that Cinderella is about this persecuted heroine. Yeah, that's debatable. They also decided that any story that had cross-dressing in it or homosexuality was way out. We just don't even include those stories. So it's kind of a bit like the Dead Sea Scrolls. What got left out of the Bible? What got left out of the classification system of folk tales based on the politics and the moral sense at the time of those people? So what there's been since then, and particularly since feminist criticism took off in the 1970s, it started bringing in this whole range of debate about the politics of the stories, who collected them, how they were collected, what was left out, the sexism in them, the racism that's in them, the colonialist values that are in them, and then broadening that so that we can start to get a greater post-colonial sense of what stories are told around the world and why and how. So a couple of key things about these folk tales. I've mentioned a few already. They're kind of flat, little emotion. There's magic, there's good, there's evil, there's simple linear plots, recurring numbers, 3, 7, 12. And then they carry just a whole bunch of universal truths. And the other thing that's characteristic of a folk tale is because there's so many versions of them, there's not one author. So they're kind of considered to be anonymous until they were claimed by the ones who went to actually write them down and print them. And we'll start to get into some of them. One brief few seconds on another little bit of fairy tale theory. A Russian guy, Vladimir Prop, he decided that there were only 7 key characters across all fairy tales, and that there were only 31 things that would actually happen in a fairy tale. He sort of mapped them all out into a bit like a hero's journey of, first of all, there's setting the scene, then there's a conflict that comes in, and then there's a whole series of things that happens, and that he came up with 31 possible happenings. And not all of them happen in every fairy tale, but basically all plots will fit into what he thought. But he only wrote about Russian stories. So you can see why there's so much debate and politickings in fairy tale university departments. Okay, so one of the things with looking at the oral history of fairy tales, we'll get to the literary stuff in a moment. This is another way of categorizing them. So in the oral stories, they originated often as something to be told. I think there was actually a few reasons why they developed in the first place, but they're often told when people were doing really repetitive, boring tasks. Can you imagine a spinning room or a weaving room without stories being told? For entertainment, for teaching, the children that were in there, and for often having, similar to maybe what some kids' stories have these days, you tell the story and the kids hear it and they pick up this level, and the adults start chuckling because there's also that level. And then for those in the know, there's also other levels as well. So fairy tales, like tarot cards, are a great way of hiding heresy, or what was considered to be heresy by the church, or politically incorrect by the state. So it was a way of having this underground river of other information, of carrying I'll just call it heresy, because I love that idea of this level of subversiveness. So these stories, and just to give you an example of that, is that some of the old matrifocal symbolism carries through with a number of them as well, and that old, I guess, shamanic perspective as well, ways of traveling, of crossing the worlds. So a lot of the key symbols that particularly arose in Europe, like in France, for instance, and in England through the medieval times, say from the 1112s, 1400s, is that there were a lot of princesses in towers. for instance. And there's a real referencing or some of the key symbols that relate into what was happening in France at the time over those years related to Catharism, for instance, and the Albigensian Crusade. So it ties into some of those old mysteries of the Christ Magdalene story. So it was a whole other underground river that related to the way of love, for instance, which is also related to what tarot carried as well, with some of those, the Cathar or the Bogomil stories that couldn't be told out loud. But it's only a fairy tale, it's only a folk tale, it's all about magic and talking animals. You know, what's your problem? It's not political, unless you had ears to hear and the eyes to see, and you could pick up on some of those cues. So coming back to the spinning rooms full of spinsters, literally, or, for example, other repetitive tasks, sewing, for mending, weaving, churning butter, for instance, stitching up tackle or fishing nets. Then over those long northern winter nights when stories would be told. So they were often really bawdy, erotic, earthy, raw, gruesome, violent, sly, humorous, cunning, and they had things that would be relevant for this is how you can make more money, or this is a great story of how this poor silly person outwitted that silly rich person. This is the way that you can make your way up in the world. So, for example, with Straparola, which was a made-up name, basically it was an Italian name of a mid-1500s guy who put in Venice, who put a whole bunch of fairy tales, folk tales in print for one of the first times for a big book of these tales. So his name just means, okay, I talk a lot. And he drew from a lot of oral tradition and said, my stories basically are not original, and which kind of gave a lot of authors license to get away with all sorts of things. I didn't write it. Don't blame me if it upsets anybody. I drew it from the people. And he was writing in Venice in the mid-1500s, where there was a massive economic downturn. So it was kind of like a years of depression in Venice. And also it was illegal to have a socially unequal marriage. Noble people couldn't marry poor people. They had to only marry nobles. So the only way to get a lot of money is if you married a rich person. But because you couldn't do that, if you put it in terms of a magical story, therefore it was okay. So a lot of these stories are about giving people hope, giving people other perspectives, giving people a laugh at their betters. Of course, the aristocratic stories brought in slightly different motifs. So these oral tradition brought together like a shared experience of belonging. It taught people about their society and their culture. It taught people potential dangers or threats, things to look out for. It brought communities together. It educated it. They create social cohesion. And they also hold this whole other relationship with potential, with possibilities. So actually, I was just thinking of some of the other subversive stuff. There's a whole a series of articles that I've been reading about Cinderella, which says because she's the cinders, the Aschenputtel, the cinder girl who's black, she's that's related to the Song of Songs, which is related to the sacred marriage, the Hieros Gamos, and that's actually just a code word for the Black Madonna. So there's sort of all sorts of things that tie in. That's a whole other story. It's hard just leaving that one there. So they've just been absolutely dismissed from the 19th century onwards as entertainment, as something silly and fluffy for children and for women. They're not intellectual, and let's just dismiss them and keep them just keep them for children. And that's not what they were devised for. So literary fairy tales, just to backtrack a little bit, is literary fairy tales are the ones that were written down, the ones that were printed, that are often associated with one author. They have fancier language. They often have more emotions in with them. And we'll go into that of who actually came up with some literary fairy tales and why, and the politics and morals of those. But there's a real, just want to mention it because there's a real weaving in, a bit of a yin and a yang with literary and oral ones, because oral folk tales are the roots of most of the literary ones, like The Little Mermaid, for instance, that Hans Christian Andersen came up with. There's so many old folk tales about mermaids and undines and water beings. He just didn't come up with a mermaid, this being with a fin tail that talked. It's rooted in so many other old symbols and tales. So he turned it into a literary fairy tale. For example, it went to film, it went to songs, and it changed form. And when these stories then got told out loud to others, then they kind of went back into an oral form. So there's this dance between what's literary and what's oral. I don't think you can have them as separate streams at all. So let's just go and have a look at a few of the key people and beings involved, books involved. 1001 Nights, Alf Layla wa Layla, Arabian Nights. This was, there's a few really radical things in this as well. Basically, the whole underlying premise of 1001 Nights is we have Scheherazade, who is the storyteller, who tells all of these beautiful stories. And why she's doing that is that there's a sheikh and his brother who have decided that women are just the pits, that they were married and their wives were unfaithful. So of course they had to kill them. And then the sheikh decided that, okay, well, I'll get a new woman every night. I'm going to have a virgin every night and I'll kill her in the morning because he can't trust her anyway. So he went through and slaughtered all the virgins in his country. And then it was like, okay, well, where do we get more? And then his Grand Vizier's daughter said, I'm going to do this. She's the absolute heroine of this. She said, enough of this bloody, murderous rampage. I'm going to draw upon my skills. How are we going to change this monster? And she went in and she started telling stories, and he was fascinated. And she didn't just tell great stories, but she told great stories about faithful women. She told great stories about women's courage. She told stories about monstrous men and what women had to put up with. She told stories about how if women were bad, it's usually because some bloke pushed her into it in some way, or how she could learn other ways of being if she truly was a mean one. She just kept telling stories and stories and stories until the sheikh realized that love could blossom in his heart once more. And isn't that a radical thing? So the Arabian Nights was drawn from Sanskrit, from India, from Persia, and amalgamated together in sort of the 600s, 700s, 800s, and was added to. So I'm just going to flick through some of these pretty fast. I mentioned Straparola before. He was in the mid sort of 1500s that he was publishing his fairy tales called The Facetious Nights or The Pleasant Nights, which is one of the first known printed versions of fairy tales. I mean, we had Boccaccio a bit earlier and we had Chaucer, but they were a little bit different. Then we had Giambattista Basile, and he was glorious because he was from Naples. And what he did was that he wrote in his original Neapolitan dialect. No fancy great Latin for him. He wanted it raw and organic and earthy. And he wrote the Tale of Tales, Il Conto della Conti, or called the Pentamerone. And he wrote some of the, whoops, this has gone super sensitive. He wrote some of the earliest tale versions of Rapunzel and Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. And his versions were then really drawn upon, and also from Straparolas, to fuel the Grimm brothers. And we're going to get to the Grimms in a little bit, because there's a few things that I'd really like to say about them and what they did. Yeah, I'm just having a little grim reaction here. I'll explain more very soon. So Jean-Baptiste brought in, they were just really earthy and violent, and you would not recognize some of the Sleeping Beauties or Rapunzels. There was pregnancies, there were rapes, there was cannibalism, there was just, you name it. There were murders, there were ogres, there were evil mothers. And it's interesting. Mothers stopped being potentially evil when the Grimm brothers got hold of them, because the Grimms, when they started collecting all their stories, and there's these jealous, murderous mothers here and there, they decided, oh no, that can't be right. Mothers have to be all good. So they started anchoring in that loving mothers who will do anything for their children, who are never angry, and who will can save them across time and spirit. So they made stepmothers evil. And that started launching that whole trope of evil stepmothers. They also did a really, I have a slightly judgmental response with so-called witches. And actually, it's curious, the history of witchery in folk tales, initially in the early days, they weren't witches. They were old women who were ordinary old women who also had magical skills or had power, often lived in forests or lived out in the desert. I'll just have another slight digression and then track my way back through these digressions. Fairy tales, as I was saying before, are really related to the land. Like the German ones, for instance, or the French or the Spanish ones, often have a lot of a lot of forests in them. And the forest itself is like this character in the story. Go to the UK or Scotland or Ireland, and you have a lot of ocean-related stories. The stories of selkies and mer people, also in Scandinavia. And then if you go to the Middle Eastern lands, then you have a lot of stories that are all revolving around the desert, and the desert itself is a real character. So oops, I've just lost my second or third digression, tracking back from that. So the Grimms, that's right, changing witches. They were initially old women who just had power, who lived in forests or in deserts, and they had magic. Of course, everybody knew they just had magic. Then they started changing, and they become fairies, beautiful fairies with magic. Then they became ugly fairies. And then they became fairy godmothers or sorceresses and ugly witches. So it's sort of been this progression of this portrayal. This is a whole other lecture. The relationship throughout history to magic, to enchantment, and to power, and to women, and what's considered magic. And we also, if you trace the role of the Inquisition and the role of the church over that time as well, in the viewing of what magic is, and our relationship with nature, and our interdependence with nature. And that altered considerably once we got to industrialization as well. Okay, so Jean-Baptiste. Oh, and these glorious, glorious people. Let's have a brief mention about les conteuses. So in late Louis XIV France, when it was the court of the aristocratic court was starting to get more conservative. He'd married his mistress, Madame de Maintenon, and she suddenly had become really super pious. So the whole court became very virtuous and pious, which in complete contrast to how it had been before. And it was also coming just in the height of so many of state domination, of parliamentary domination, headed by the monarch. And it was loaded with so many rules and regulations. And this group of women, these aristocratic, these noble women, were doing a lot of writing over this time in the late 17th century. So there were books being published sort of in the 1690s onwards, and there's quite a few of those women. So, for example, Marie Catherine, Countess d'Aulnay, she was the one who actually termed the phrase conte de fées, or fairy tale. And what a lot of these women were doing, there was something like 41 volumes of fairy tales that were published over that time. And most of those were by women. We just haven't heard about them. And that's for a few reasons. These stories were rich, they were highly textured, they were emotional. One of the women, Catherine Bernard, said the setting has to be fantastical and magnifique, but the emotion has to be very natural. The emotion has to be true. And they were complex and they were quite long, and they were radical and they were feminist stories. These women were deliberately using the genre of fairy tale, of the fantastic, as a covering screen for this is not okay what's happening to women in this land. This is not okay what the king is doing. But you can't get us because it's only a fairy tale. So these were women of the French court who were writing fairy tales that were complaining about arranged marriages and the threat of violence to women. Madame d'Aulnay has a fascinating story. She was a spy. She tried to get her violent husband up on charges. She ended up having to escape through a window because she was a spy for different countries. She was trying to protect her friends from domestic violence. She had 4 children before she was 20. She was married at 15. So she was writing stories that were complaining about all of this, and writing stories about love and what love could be and what marriages weren't. And they were incredibly radical, most of these stories by these women. And it was a way of having a voice in politics that they didn't have in any other kind of way. So it was a way that they could say, it's just for fun. Don't worry about it. You can't get us, even though a few of them did end up being exiled from Paris because it was just a little bit too subversive. Now, also at the same time as them, there was another guy who was high up in the Académie Française, Charles Perrault. And Charles Perrault was also writing fairy tales. He had a really moralistic bent to them. He was the one who absolutely stated it outright. That, for example, Little Red Riding Hood is a warning of the dangers of promiscuity. If you're not virtuous, you'll end up dead. And that's a really good thing. And it's fine if your husband kills you, if you're curious, because women being curious is a really, really, really bad thing. So really dodgy, filthy kind of stuff. And then the Grimm brothers, when they came along in the early 1800s, they picked up all of these fairy tales. What they did, and why Charles Perrault is so famous today, is basically because of the Grimm's brothers, because of sexism, because he was a bloke for a start, and because why on earth would we look at what all these women are writing? It's only silly women's stuff. It's too emotional. It's too flowery. It's too ornate. And Charles Perrault is the only person from that time who has really, really good stories. So he got printed over and over and over, and these incredible authors disappeared. You can, and some of them still aren't even translated into English today, but you can access them these days. And I really wanted to mention them to bring in some of that hidden history that just disappears due to the politics of it all. So, oops, it disappeared. So Charles, I've already mentioned a little bit. He brought in some of the really famous stories laden with morality, like Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Bluebeard. It's fine to kill many, many wives and have sequential wife marrying in this Henry VIII kind of way, because, you know, they were bad. Cinderella, Little Thumb, those sorts of stories. And let's move on and go from Charles into the Grimm brothers. Now, I should just say I have no idea of the time because of the time doesn't come up when I'm looking at screen share. So I'm aware I'll probably have to speak a little bit faster. The Grimm brothers were collecting fairy tales, collecting folk tales in the early 1800s. Let me read a little bit from a book of mine, Fairytales from 1949. And it says they were born at Hanau in Germany and educated, this is in the frontispiece, educated at Marburg University. They were academics, they were scholars. Both were subsequently on the staff of Göttingen University and later moved to Berlin. As quite young men, the brothers began a life's work of research into the folklore of their country, listening to and writing down legends and stories as they heard them in the cottages of the peasants, in village inns and in country places. They discovered material in medieval manuscripts preserved in libraries and museums, and keeping strictly to the originals, made their world-famous collections of fairy and folk tales. Doesn't that sound nice? Most of it is absolute hogwash, except for their date of birth and the fact that they went to university. They were patriotic nationalists who did not go to any peasants, but they were trying to draw upon and to create a German identity, a sense of unification in Germany. And the people that they were gathering the stories from were middle-class or aristocratic women. They were their friends and their neighbors, a few nursery maids, like Gamma Gretel, who was this old woman shown on the front of one of their frontispieces of Kinder und Hausmärchen, so children, the Children and Household Tale book. So Gamma Gretel, it sort of gives you this idea, like Charles Perrault wrote Mother Goose Tales, this idea that these stories are from women, old women who are peasant women, because that makes them more pure and more true. One of the reasons why the Grimm brothers stopped going to these old manuscripts where stories had been written down was because they couldn't possibly be from the people, the Volk, because they were so bawdy, scatological, and impure. So they ignored those stories and gathered the nice sounding ones from their rich neighbors, who were primarily emigres from the French Revolution. So they were French Huguenots, most of these stories were from. Or for example, everybody knows that Sleeping Beauty is a French story. The Grimms knew it was a French story. Charles Perrault knew that it was. But the Grimms, in order to make it sound more German, what they did was they hunted everywhere. And then at last they said, in the Norse mythology, Brunhilde falls into an enchanted sleep. So therefore, Sleeping Beauty is German. And they started marketing it as a German story, because what they were desperately trying to do is to create this German identity. And they had an idea that German identity could be found in the folk, in the peasants of the land, in the people, because through the people there's that they would find the the innocent story, the true language, the true meaning of what it is to be German. Of course, Hitler thought this was a brilliant idea and actually took the Grimm's fairy tales, insisted that every household should have one, and used them as propaganda, as an Aryan ideology of true Germanness, which is also why after World War II, the Grimm's fairy tales were banned in England because of that link with German Nazism as well. So one of the things that I'll just go a smidgen over time. One of the things that the Grimms were actually doing is at the time, it was at the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon had taken over most of Europe. You can see on this map here all the enormous French Empire. And what Napoleon had done had taken hundreds of little separate feudalist Germanic or Prussian-Hungarian Empire states, unified them together to create the Confederation of the Rhine, and France was occupying a lot of Germany, or Germany didn't exist. It was only coming into form. So it was also the time of, let me come back to that, of let's create this sense of national identity. What actually is Germanness? And they had this very Rousseau idea of the noble savage, that this uncorrupted, wise, primitive being. I mean, how dodgy is that? The Volk, if we get it from the Volk, it means the common people, and it means the nation. So, I mean, it wasn't true at all. It was this part of the Romantic movement. So they grew up in poverty, they became academics, and then they started collecting stories. And they were also gathering a lot of other linguistic, they were linguists primarily. They were creating dictionaries, they were gathering folk songs. So what they did was that they put these stories together in a book, Kunde and Hausmärchen, the Wonder Tales, and had it first of all published in 1812. They said that they were the original stories, which is garbage. They edited them. There's less editing in the first book, but what actually happened, which is fascinating, and maybe because of the title, Children's and Household Storybook, is that there was this rising middle class and this idea of childhood. So the Grimm's book of tales took off like a rocket and became so immensely popular. Like they were on the New York bestsellers kind of top of the list for decades. And they also cornered the Christmas shopping market for this new children's sort of marketing, I guess. So what they realized was when parents were reading this book to children, it was like, whoa, baby, we really need to edit this. These stories aren't okay for children. So what they did, which is so hilarious, is that they edited the stories heavily, made them kind of neater and a little bit more linguistically stylized. They originally tried to put in these sort of low German, how peasants might speak kind of dialect when they were writing them to make them look more authentic, which was really fake. And they kept in a fair bit of the violence and a bit of the sex. And then parents started complaining, you know, this is not a good language for our children to learn. It's so common. And there's this bourgeois reaction. So then they tidied up the language, made it more High German. And what they did was they got rid of any reference to sex. Rapunzel was not pregnant any longer. She just suddenly had 2 children that appeared. Sort of all sorts of things like that. But they ramped up the violence, which is so weird. I mean, for example, in the Juniper Tree, this story where an evil stepmother, who originally used to be an evil mother, slammed a trunk down on the head of her stepson, knocked his head off and killed him, chopped him up and cooked him and fed him to her daughter. I mean, imagine reading that to your children. A bit dodgy. But basically, they brought in even more violence, like Cinderella's evil stepsisters at the end get their eyes pecked out by doves, for instance. That wasn't in any of the other stories. They just brought it in for who knows what reason. So what they did do is that they brought in a methodology. Yeah, they were dodgy as all hell. Yeah, they edited the stories. Yeah, they claimed them as original. Not at all. But they brought in a clear methodology, and they unified a few stories, approximately 585 of them that they gathered, and then they sort of summarized a whole bunch of them. They mashed them all together, and then printed them. So they kind of created what became known as the definitive versions of particular fairy tales like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Red Riding Hood, stories like that, which then got adapted. So if people say, oh yeah, I know the story of Cinderella, for instance, or Hans the Hedgehog, it's from the Grimms. They became so darn famous, translated everywhere, and also it coincided with mass printing that became cheaper and more accessible as well. So a very quick flick through some of the others. Norwegian ones, Peter Christian Asbjørnsen and Jørgen Moe came up with really fabulous ones. And I just wanted to mention them because so many of the Grimm stories, they made women more passive. They made women more villainous. They actually put in more villains. They made them more moral. But for example, Tatterhood that Asbjørnsen and Moe came up with was this great kick-ass story of two sisters who get on really well, an ugly one and a beautiful one. And they are so darn close. And the firstborn one is, she rides a goat, she waves a spoon around, and she just thrashes the pants off anything. And there's no female competitiveness or jealousy, which the Grimms brought in a lot of female competition. So great story. Hans Christian Andersen, so sad, so many of his stories. Gets pretty moralistic. There's a lot of links between what he was writing about, this national treasure, and I mean, it's so poetic, a lot of his stories, but oh my goodness, so it's very, very sad, and often highly Christianized as well. I'm sorry, Hans, to be flicking over you so abominably fast. You deserve a lot more than 3 seconds. A lot were based on fairy tales that he'd heard, a few that he'd made up as well. One of the very few with a happy ending is The Snow Queen, which has then got translated into Disney's Frozen. Oscar Wilde, because he was one of the first rad ones who changed a little bit of the genre of fairy tales and altered some of the ways that they can be told. They were so poignant, a lot of his stories, and he celebrated love and compassion and kindness and generosity of spirit and detested selfishness. So I mentioned him briefly. Lafcadio Hearn wrote a lot of, he lived in Japan for a long time and loved it. And he wrote transcribed a lot of Japanese ghost stories and exquisite, elegant, beautiful stories. Disney, what can I say? What Disney brought in with their particular tropes. And if you think about, for example, Snow White, one of the highest grossing films of all time in 1937 at the height of the Depression, was bringing in these themes. It was like Disney propaganda of, if you work hard, you'll get ahead. You can go from riches to rags to riches again. Have hope. Be cheery. Sing as you work, like the little dwarves do. Yeah, we all sort of know that little hey ho song, I think. So it was a, let's just buck up and we're in it here together and good times will come again, Vera Lynn. So he also brought in a lot more anthropomorphized animals, pros and cons to that, appalling gender and race politics, but also then it's sort of this interesting relationship between how culture and society impacts on what tales are told and how they're told, as well as tales will have an impact on a culture. If you think of, I'll just use America as an example for the moment, of wishing upon a star. If you work hard, you'll get ahead. If you have allies and good mates, so Australian, you'll get ahead. If you hold to your dream and persevere, it'll be okay. happy ever after Cinderella complex. All you need is a good man and you'll be okay. I mean, there's so many themes that they've really really worked with, and they're also trying to update it a lot more these days as well. I think one of my all-time favorite things was when Fiona, the Shrek, kissed Shrek and stayed a green ogre. Wasn't that delicious? It was just this changing around of these notions of beauty and differently abled folks as well. So what makes fairy tales still relevant and so powerful today? We're talking about this a lot more before as well. I mean, ultimately, the whole idea of fairy tales, of their underlying theme is be kind, be compassionate, be loyal, trust in something, no matter how wildly bizarre and out there. Trust that there is another world out there that you can access, that there is enchantment, whatever that may mean to you. It's an invitation into, you don't have to be caught where you are, but let's tell you a story about somebody who was in that very fix and got out of it, and this was the way that they did it. Here's another perspective. Come out of being caught in your little bubble. Try this on. They're teaching tales, they're wisdom tales, they're medicine tales. They're tales about power, about how to meet fear. They're tales of how to overcome shortcomings. They're tales that bridge so many times. They bring us into, what I love is that they're not rooted in time and space, but they bring us into a heart realm of potential. They bring us into circular space, circular time, where all times are one time, where we can access all sorts of other things. They're transformative. And one of the biggest things that I've really found with working with these tales is, and this has really blown me away, is that they have an incredible life force of their own. When you engage with a story as a teacher, as a guide, it gives you a framework which holds you in a safe way, not always comfortable, but safe. And they carry you. And I've seen things come into my environment. I've seen things shift, ideas. It's like that archetypal force engages with you. As you choose to engage with it, it is working with you as well. So that there's it's like they're animals. There's a life that they have that picks you up and holds you. There's a chalice at which we can be carried in these stories. And I think I know that's because of the way they bridge the mythopoetic realm. They bring us into that realm of the other world, the world that is between this one. So it's a way of weaving and bridging that which we have become disconnected from, and it brings us into a heart space. They're eco-shamanic, radically subversive, and immensely powerful beings. In a real nutshell, advertising. I came up just with a few ads that I came across, just briefly showing you a few of these, of how they're still permeating our culture, just in so many ways. And one of my favorite quotes from Sharon Blackie: "Fairy tales and myths are the stories which offer us a more enriching set of values to live by. Fairy tales and myths show us that the greatest treasure of all is a kind heart. The most powerful magic is always made from an act of love, and no life-saving or world-changing goal can ever be achieved without the help of a community of others, human and non-human alike." And I'll give you a pile of references. Oh, and I just want to mention as well, I've got let me come over here, and I will just send to everybody. I've got, let me escape from you. I've got a thing on fairy tale references. This is not exhaustive. Am I able to bring that in? Whoops. No, it's not letting me bring it in. I'll get the Leah to email it all to everybody who's registered. And no, it's not sliding over. So I'd love to, for any of you who would like to linger, I know I've gone a bit over time here, this thing that I'm so passionate about, but if there's any questions or anything that you would like to bring up, I'm really happy to stay and talk fairy tales for a little while. And also to let you know that coming up in October, I'm going to be running a whole process with around a fairy tale story called The Tangled Wood, which is a 5-week process of diving in this transformational kind of way. So let's just open the boxes. That does sound weird, doesn't it? Open your mics if there's any of you who would like to come up with any comments or anything.
It was so wonderful. Just completely wonderful. Tell us more about Tangled Wood if you feel like it. I mean, it's such an immersion into alchemical magic and delight. And yes. I want to walk with you in the woods tonight.
The Tangled Wood. Oh, the whole idea of the forest and that idea of what walks into a forest, who walks in, and the forest is representative of a threshold. It's an initiation. And who walks in isn't the one who walks out. So what happens when you go in? And I'm working with the story of the Sleeping Beauty, Briar Rose, and that's just got so many rich analogies, metaphors that we can draw around. When is it important to go into a tower and sleep? Like for me, it's really important that we actually have our own withdrawal temple space. We need to really bring in dreaming and visions. And at this time, particularly on the planet, what do we wake up from? What are we falling asleep from? And I love the metaphor of the 13th fairy, the one who wasn't invited to the table. What happens when she comes in?
On that yesterday.
Did you?
Can we find you? I mean, I feel like I walked into a fairy tale. I'll be quiet to let other people speak too, but your voice is so playful and loving that I felt like as soon as you showed up, in a fairy tale, and I need to continue it. So can I find you in some way?
Yes. Yes, you can. The information for Tangled Wood will be through Leah Lamb's website coming up very, very soon. You can get me on my Facebook site. My website is being absolutely rewritten at the moment and not around, but my Facebook, Jacqui Bushnell, or my email, just send me a message. Let me know if anything comes up for you as well. And thank you. And Jean, I saw Jean's hand go up. And a couple of others as well. So, and are you able to take yourself off mute there, Jean? I can see your hand. Yeah. Is that? Oh, there you go.
There. Hi.
Great. You're on. You're live.
I just wanted to say that time as 2 hours. So you've got time yet, no?
Oh, it was actually meant to be an hour, and there's been a few typos that seem to have happened. So I'm really happy to stay for 2 hours and keep talking, but I'm also aware that some people had an idea that it was only an hour. So I'm happy to play for both of those as well. Any other ideas or questions? Because there's so many ways that we can dance with this, and so many other things that we can chat about as well. You received 1.5 hours. Okay. Yeah, Claire.
Sleeping Beauty's been interesting. My husband died 3 years ago, and around the 1st of January this year, I was telling people it's like I woke up. And I said, this must be what it was like when Sleeping Beauty woke up and looked, rubbed her eyes and said, what the hell happened to that decade or two? It's really, it helped me get a handle on it.
Yes, it's really curious as well. What I'm hearing in that story for you, Claire, is there was something that put you into an entirely other place, a tragedy that happened, and then something happened. What is it that wakes us up? What is it that clicks something else in? So, I'm back in this other aspect of the world, or another part of my being has woken up. I was like an automaton before, or my creativity was asleep, or my playful self was asleep. There was a part of me that wasn't alive and active in the world, and something just woke up. In that fairy tale, it's the prince. And the prince, all these stories are so symbolic and metaphorical. It's not necessarily a literal prince and the happy ever after, but the instigator. It's like sacred masculine meets sacred feminine. And what is it in an active dynamic force that comes in and says, now is your time to come into the world with something? All of these stories, for those with the eyes to see and the ears to hear, as they, I'm just thinking of a Red Riding Hood at the moment. Oh, what big ears you have, Grandma. What big eyes you have. Yeah, there were so many other hidden motifs in that story as well, for those who could tune into what they actually were. And interesting as well, for example, with that Red Riding Hood story, in one of the older versions, the more I don't like to use the word pagan, one of the more, I guess, earth-centered matrifocal versions of the story, is it's based straight on the Inanna myth. You can't actually separate mythology from these stories. That one leads into the other, and these symbols and these archetypes carry over. It's just that one is a little maybe more colloquial or created particularly in relation to what's happening in a culture. And you can see from that very, very rapid précis of the history is how they were adapted to cultures at a particular time. Even just looking at how Disney adapted those stories to the Great Depression, to the Cold War and post-World War II, to race relationships, to women need to be more active and more dynamic in our stories. So just that adaptation. And they both speak to us and they reflect ourselves back to us. They also, what I love about when we step into these stories is they give us an externalized framework at which to look at ourself and our culture, our societies. So they're a way of, oh yeah, I can see how, like Claire was saying, I can see how I can relate to Sleeping Beauty. I woke up. That was like I was kissed awake by something. I was woken up by love in some way, by a kiss of recognition. And I came out of my tower. I mean, it's like lockdown. It's literally, we're living a Sleeping Beauty myth at the moment. In so many ways. And we're waking up in the world as well in different ways, with different questions now about our government, about health, about so many things. And it really brings us into what stories are we going to carry? What stories are actually alive in the world that are unconscious in me? And do I actually want to run with those or not? Essentially, that Sleeping Beauty story, why I love it so much, is it's about spells, it's about curses, it's about banishing something. I'm just thinking of, like, my background is as a herbalist, and in Australia, naturopathy, herbal medicine, has been taken off. You can no longer, people can't get private health insurance now for naturopathy. It's like we've been banished. What's being banished from our world? Enchantment has, Great Connection has, and we're trying to reclaim that. We're coming into, I mean, look at what's happening with, I'll just use the word rewilding. There's this greater push against, let's bring science, rationalism, logic together and marry sacred feminine, sacred masculine together into a greater sense of mystery. So they give us an externalized framework at which we can question not only ourselves, but our world. What are the stories? What are the spells? Yeah. I could talk about this forever.
Jacqui.
Yeah, Tracy, and that could be someone else. Yeah.
Oh, with laughter everywhere. You know, I was thinking about that sense of space, and I live in Australia now. I grew up in South Africa. My family and roots in England, and I have always had the Brother Grimm stories and Mother Goose stories have been, and the Arabian Night stories have been fundamental to my childhood, and I think crafted part of who I am as a being. They're not my land where I am now. And I just, you know, I have a strong sense of the forests and the mermaids and even the Disney version, but they're not my current land of Australia. And when I listen to the Indigenous stories, they feel very other to me at the moment. And I'm just wondering about the connections, these archetypes. Is there Indigenous Australian wisdom that you have connected with or leaned into at this point?
Oh, what a rich, rich question, Tracy. And what do we do with our, speak for myself, colonialist background and my heritage? I'm living in Australia and have been born here, and I'm third generation born in Australia. Yet my heritage is pure Irish, Scottish, English. And I know for me, I relate to forests. I'm so at home in southern France and in England, and I'd love to live in Scotland. And yet I love this land passionately and relate to it. And I'm not Indigenous. And there's so many other things that tie in with appropriation of Indigenous stories, which are rooted in ancestors, rooted in culture, and they're precious to those people. I can't just go in and take those stories, but yet I want to understand my land from an Indigenous perspective. And I have a lot of questions. How do we navigate this? How do we do that? And I had a really interesting experience last year when I was in lockdown for a long time. And I was by myself for quite a while, for 7 months, and me and 3 million trees. And what happened was I realized I was writing a lot of fables, a lot of fairy stories, and I love speaking them, and they're kind of more Celtic, I'd say, stories. And I was talking to the land, and I'm talking to the trees and the river. It's like I usually like to tell stories, but I feel wrong at telling you or sharing this Celtic story that has me. It was the story of Rhiannon that I've been has held me for a year or so, and I've been working, or longer. It's been working me for a long time, and I didn't feel I could tell that story to the land because it's like bringing in a species that is foreign. It's like introducing something else. So I was saying, what do I do here? How do I bridge this? And the response was, it made me cry. The response was, are you wrong in this land? You live here and you tend this place and you care for this place. How can you be wrong if you are standing here on this land? How can your history be wrong in this place? Because you are what you are, and you are precious, and you are here. So the stories that you hold and the stories that you carry are part of you. As you speak them, all we see and all we know is you and all that you are. So tell your stories and we will respond. Tell your stories because they are you, and tell the stories that are true to you. Because I was trying to tell, do I just say an indigenous story? No. And they said, no, that's not true to you. Be what you are. Because I was given a story then that you cannot not belong. That there is no way that you can be outside of the land. There is no way you can be outside of this world. It's not a choice, belonging. We just think it is. So we are automatically enfolded in the mandala, the matrix of all that is. So it was an invitation into recognizing that you are enough. I am enough in this moment, and I am all that I am, and I am my heritage. So I spoke the story of Rhiannon to the trees, and I got back a whole different perspective about that story that I knew inside out. And then when I told it to the bulbs, and then when I told it to the fire, and then when I told it to the river, and when I told it to the sky, I got different reflections back of what it was. So I found a peace in myself as a PEACE and a PIECE as well, of myself, that wove me and my stories and my heritage into it. And there's still a lot of questions as well that are really rich and painful and important to ask. So I really honor you and thank you for bringing up something around colonialism and where and how we belong, and Indigenous stories and heritage. Yeah. Oh,
I'd like to make it, if I could add something to that.
Please.
I've been associated with the Native American community in Wisconsin for many, many years. And after a good 10 years that I had been associated with that community, I had the opportunity to study in England storytelling for a semester. But part of that was also going off to Ireland and Scotland to be in touch with my Celtic roots. And part of it was learning the indigenous base for the Celtic stories that I heard. And I went back home and I went to my Native American friends, to that community, and I recognized that some of the very same things that I learned about the Celtic indigenous way back history were basically the same as the indigenous celebrations and beliefs and connection to the earth that the Native American people have. And it changed me with the sense of, you go around the world anywhere, and if you dig deep enough and go back far enough, as the Native people say, all things are connected.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There's a Buddhist saying, all Dharma meets at one point. I think it's just different names. Yes. Thank you for sharing that root. Yeah. And isn't that just a call to listen to what is true in yourself and honor all stories? And particularly these days where I'm just noticing how much more divisiveness and polarizing there is in the world. This story's right. No, this story is right. Such a call to come into a space where we're honoring different voices. Oh, you hold that story as true. Well, I hold this one. And how do we actually bridge this to be in relationship together with people who are holding absolutely opposite views? How do we find a way of navigating that? And I think what you've come up with there, Jean and Tracy, is that there's a route. There is a place at which we can meet without necessarily agreeing or finding something that enables it to bridge, and that we relate to different flavors or themes or styles of the stories, both culturally. Yeah, Tracy.
You mentioned that fairy tales are shamanic, and I wondered if you wanted to unpack that a little bit.
I think anything that has so many talking animals and that connects you with the mythopoetic realms, I think that's they are in a few different ways because of that link with enchantment, where magic is still in the world, however you might like to define magic, where the impossible is possible. Nobody blinks an eye at spinning gold from straw. Nobody blinks an eye at, okay, walking 7 leagues in a set of boots. So they're a way of stretching our consciousness into other possibilities, and I would call that into other realms as well. Most wells in a fairy tale, there's a light in there, you go down and you're in the underworld. Climb a tree, or beanstalk like Jack. Actually, that story, Jack and the Beanstalk, was actually collected from Australia. But anyway, Jack climbed up and went into the upper world. There's the realm of fairy in so many of the stories. Fairy crisscrosses with human. So they're an invitation to bridge realms. And if there's anything that teaches us that you can laugh at impossible, it's nature. There's so many things that are technically impossible in nature. Hummingbirds shouldn't exist, for instance. Bumblebees shouldn't exist, and yet they do. They don't know they're impossible. So many things. So that relationship with nature in the stories and with enchantment brings us into envisioning new possibilities that stretch our idea of what we think might be feasible or possible. They bring us into a realm of there's another way. And it's an invitation to trust. It's an invitation to surrender to a possibility, to allow there to be a resonance between you and one of these other realms. And what we know now from actually just thinking of science, from the way plants sing, from the forest and the interconnected, the World Wide Web, literally, of mycelium in forests. We know that trees communicate. We know that animals communicate. And that they do that through smell, through sound, through language, other than, well, sometimes with a voice, but in ways that we don't. So it's an invitation for us to stretch our perception so that we can begin to perceive language in a broader, greater way. So that maybe it will be just normal that an eagle comes down and talks to you. It is in most Indigenous cultures, or if you're doing your own journey work, eagle will talk to you. So fairy tales are a way of bringing that in even more. Erin, yeah.
I didn't think I had a question, and I was just looking at my notes. When you were talking about Arne Thomason, or
yes, Uther.
And you said they left out some categories, I think.
Yes.
Cross-dressing, or so. Is there a source where one can find these folk tales? Because I just went to a healing storytelling workshop with Kevin Kling, and somebody in the class was asking where they could find these tales, and I still haven't found the answer from her or for her.
Okay, check out some of the Moldavian fairy tales. They are full of cross-dressers and wild women. Some of the Russian, Slovenian, Slovakian, Moldavian, Estonian ones. Maria Morevna, who's this wild woman. There's a few cross-dressing men, but mainly cross-dressing women ones. I've come across most of them in, actually I found it on the net, Moldavian folk tales. It's a matter of trawling. I have read so many of Andrew Lang's stories through all of his volumes. I have trawled through Russian stories, Serbian stories. Oh my goodness, some of the, I was just thinking of a delicious one I read the other day. I was reading Chutki and Inuit Eskimo stories. So from some of the Siberian stories, and they were wild. Women with 2 vaginas, women with clitorises, the size that the hide of a snow hare couldn't cover it. I mean, they're just glorious, rich stories, and I can recommend those ones.
I'm laughing because I just heard a woman about 3 months ago. She lives in Mexico, and she told a story about coyote, and the woman had a vagina that would, it was like shark teeth, and it would hurt people.
Oh, the vagina dentata myths, yes.
Okay.
Oh, it's tricky. I pretty much live on the EDU, that education website, to see what comes up in the education sort of serious what do you call them, articles. I cruise secondhand bookstores and see whatever I can find, and op shops, and I cruise the net, which means basically doing a lot of reading. And if you look up the Gutenberg site, Gutenberg is fantastic. You can get free downloads of so many old books, everything from all the Dead Sea Scroll apocryphal books through to ones that have been out of print for a long time, through to a whole range of herbal medicine ones. And it saves you a fortune, and you can scroll and look through those. So if you Google Gutenberg free, the EDU, you can get onto that free. And then yes, Gutenberg.org, that's it, and see what you come up with. Yeah.
Another quicker question, I hope. I have some folk tales that were collected in early 1900 or late 1800s from a very small area near the Dolomites in Italy. But how do I find out if this guy did what the Grimms did to the tales? And then the other same question is folk tales that were collected in the Western Islands. I think they're called Hebrides by Ottawa Swire. So how do I know she didn't put her own interpretation on them and get other sources for those stories?
You don't. What I recommend that you do is you read the story, you get it from as many sources as you possibly can, and look at some of the symbols and read about the symbols, and then let it roll around in your mouth for a while and see what story emerges, because all of these people have claimed them and made them their own. What happens when Aaron meets this story, and what arises in that space? I don't think we'll ever get a truly original story, because Morag will have told it a little bit different than Glennis on the other side of Skye will have told it a little bit differently. I've got books. I just really love the Selkie stories, and I've got books from all around the Western Isles on Selkies collected from the 1700s onwards, and they'll shift and change, and they're related to the area. So claim it. Ask the story how it wants to tell itself to you, and see what comes out. And then notice what happens, which I love the aliveness of the story, is when I'm telling a story to somebody or some people, the audience has an impact as well. And the story will come out in the way that it needs to be told for that audience. Sometimes I've emphasized things that I had no idea were actually in there. It's like, wow, I didn't, okay. But that's what needs to be heard, because essentially these stories are medicine. So keep their medicine alive. It's like keeping, like what a good herbalist does. You pick the most life force filled plant that will be right for that person, and see what comes out, because you can trust the story. Out of everything that I've learned from them over the years, you can trust that story. How does it want to be told? It's a collaboration between you, your heart, your voice, and the audience. And whether the audience is a tree or people or your journal, see what comes out and tell that same story from each different character within it. What's the grandmother's version of Red Riding Hood, for instance, or the Selkie story? What's the child's version of the story? What's the husband's version? And build up a big-bodied picture of what the story may be for you from all of those parts. And this is a great exercise for kids to do as well, for as well as for grown-ups. Tell the story from every angle. Tell the story from the forest. What do the trees have to say about it all? What does the animal have to say? I'm about to run another story group at the moment, and I've been connecting with Wolf, and I'm telling the story every day from Wolf, and doing something called Wolf Speak, and seeing what Wolf has to say to me, which is a personal message and a bigger one as well. And it's been fascinating. That's also what I mean about the shamanic qualities. Tell the story, like with Tangled Wood from the 13th Fairy. I mean, she's got a hell of a lot of stories to tell. Start dancing with her and see what she comes up with. She's yeah, she's a bit like one of these stroppy goddesses, you know, the Kalis that come in, who are loving and compassionate, who say, stop mucking around. Here you go. Listen to this. She's not a fluffy, sweetness and light. That's what I also love about these stories. They're not fluffy. They're direct. They're to the point, and it's this. You do it or you don't. Yeah. Disney fluffed them.
Sanitized and fluffed. Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes, Marcy. Is that you?
How are you?
Oh.
Yeah, you're lovely. You know, I don't know. I don't remember my childhood. It was kind of traumatic. So how would I sort of step back into this what's a more simplistic book I could read about fairy tales?
Pick up any that you find. It might be, it doesn't matter, or just see online what, if there's any that jump out at you. It might be just in the op shop, you pick up Grimm's Fairy Tales and flick through them and see if there's any that just call to you. Even just looking at the names, and start with that. Or you might like to start with, I haven't got all my other books here. For example, looking at a bit of what they mean, like Marina Warner's Once Upon a Time, or
did you say Marina Warner?
Marina Warner. Actually, I'll just open my PDF, copy it, and I'll stick this in so you can have these details straight away. And then Leah will post it out to you as well. Oops, I don't know why it's just not letting me post anything. Click.
Could I also recommend Clarissa Pinkola Estes?
Oh, yes.
She is just,
I can't hear her.
Okay, let me just put this in.
Fairy tales. So just
Clarissa Pinkola Estes. Women Who Run with the Wolves. That is absolutely magical.
Start there.
That's not very simplistic, is it? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's basic. The stories, and it's got paste. No, it's not letting me paste a whole bunch of stuff. I can only type it. Have a look. There'll be some of her stories online, and there's some great ones you can listen to as well. Oh, great. You've got that there. Beautiful. Thanks for that. Let's see.
You said, I'm sorry. You said Marina Warner, then something
else.
Yes,
she's more a little more scholarly and theoretical. So I'd probably look at actually just seeing if there's any basic fairy tale books in your local bookstore, and any that you like the cover of. Because
I'm very visually oriented. So
if you're visually oriented, okay, then I'd start with reading or listening to one of Clarissa's, because she has the story and then it's up to you, and she writes in such a glorious way. And then you can choose to read some of her analysis or questions about it if you would like to, or you can just read the stories, because they're beautiful.
Great.
And she's just an absolute delight. Yeah.
Her Dangerous Old Woman audiobooks are amazing.
Yes.
Just to start there for something easy.
Yes.
Dangerous audiobooks.
The Dangerous Old Woman. And there's a whole series on the crone that she has. There's 4 sets of audio books, audio stories. You can't get them as books on the Old Woman, basically. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
And enjoy. Let me know how you go, and see what sings to your heart.
I love the way you talk.
And Jean has got ready to tell tales. Yeah. Okay, lovely.
I'd like to say this is this is a product from the National Storytelling Network in the United States. This is by David Holt and Bill Mooney. This is the second one. All the stories in here have an introduction with about the background, about the teller, and words to the wise at the end and how to tell it. And in this one in particular, it's from around the world. They're just amazing. So I would highly recommend this.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Mooney.
Great. Thank you for that. Any other favorites that come up? Can't hear. Someone's got a... No, okay. I'll get that information will be sent off really, really, really soon. I'm just trying to think if there's any other ones that I've had on here. Let's see, Women Who Run with the Wolves. There's so many fabulous podcasts, beautiful and blogs. One absolutely lovely one is by Terry Windling, and her blog is called Myth and More. And other ones that I always look up. Whoops. Sur la Lune is another blog site that's great. The Carter Hall group, they're pretty basic. There's a load of pods. Let's see. Actually, another lovely one you might like, though it's not specifically on fairy tales, but it's about lots of them, is Sharon Blackie's When Women Rise Rooted. And she's got a podcast as well that's rather good. Let's see. Michelle Tocker has got a beautiful one that came out not that long ago, that a book I read called The Tower Princess. She has a lovely blog and a lot of writings as well. The Tower Princess is about her... It's sort of her own personal process, but basically how she was living out Rapunzel and how she engaged with the story and how the story engaged with her and led her along. And that was, just read that a couple of weeks ago, and it was just exquisite. And I learned a lot about Rapunzel as well. Let's see who else. Oh, there's so many fabulous ones. Michael Mead has great podcasts as well as loads of books. Martin Shaw, and the other one just to really that you're all with, who I absolutely adore for her storytelling and the way she weaves in so much, is Leah. So see what Leah's got coming up as well. And if you get a chance to go along to her Hour of the Wolf, then it's where Leah brings through a story, and you'll really understand how it's just such a shamanic process where stories can come from when you connect in with that mythopoetic realm. Yeah.
Jacqui,
yes.
Hello. How about Angela Carter?
Oh my goodness, I didn't even mention Angela or Margaret Atwood or Jane Yolen or Veronica Goss. Oh, yes, Angela. Oh my goodness, she is so, forgive me, darling. She is just so absolutely, the stories are gorgeous. They're rich. It's like reading velvet, The Bloody Chamber, and she picks them up. She's part of an early sort of 1970s, 80s, 90s retelling of fairy tales. Let's claim them, make them our own, keep the themes. But she turns, for example, the grandma in Red Riding Hood into a werewolf. She subverts them. She, in Beauty and the Beast, the protagonist with Love's True Kiss becomes an animal, and they just live as wild animals together. There's she becomes a tiger. She makes Sleeping Beauty a vampire. That sort of sounds simplistic, but go and read her beautiful naughty words yourself. just rich. Yeah. There's so many wonderful ones out there where they've been rewriting them in so many really great ways as well. And so many good ones now for kids as well. Yeah. Oh goodness, we're going to need to wind on up really soon. Any last things? I'm so glad you came along. This is just gorgeous to meet you all, and hope I see you all in October. Or if there's any other ideas you get that you'd love to follow on up with, either email me or email Leah. And because she really wants to, Laurel's got a question. She really wants to actually, on her new Mighty Network site, it's going to have a story cauldron where people can put stories that they love and that they've found as well. So we can use that as a resource. She's got lots of great ideas coming up. Laurel, what did you want to say? I just saw your hand there.
Thank you so much. What comes to me with all of this wonder is once upon a time is a bit like entering an alchemical recipe, as well as a tangled forest, as well. And I just searched you and I noticed you had something with Reiki too. Was that you, or is that someone else?
Yes, that's me. Yes, I've been teaching Reiki for about 20 years. So more than that now. Goodness. So, yeah.
In this sort of segueing, there's a full moon coming, and it's a very powerful doorway always. So tonight at Gloaming, in addition to Once Upon a Time, what might be a lovely alchemical initiation to guide us into seeing what story wants to be written through us tonight?
Oh, well, let's have a breath together and feel ourselves as a circle. Let's feel all of those threads that weave us and wind us together like Ariadne's thread, like a beautiful labyrinth. And the path of the moon's light is rather like that as well. I'm wondering what it might be like to allow ourselves, with the energy of this circle, to be bathed in that light and to sing her down and to feel that, because the light of the moon is so different, and it shines and it highlights shadows in a different way than sunlight does. It makes colors different. So what might it be like to consciously have that light bathing over you, to do a little honoring and a blessing and an offering to the moon and receive the blessing back from the moon and from the velvet dark of the night sky. And then to see who catches your eye. Maybe it is the moon, that great pearl. Maybe it's a star. Maybe it's a bat. Maybe it's the way a tree shape looks. And see whatever it is that catches your eye, and then ask it a question. It might be a question that's in your heart, or ask it what it sees, or ask it what it might like to tell you once upon a time. Ask it what it would like to be asked. And Laurel and Devi, just come on in. I can see you've got questions, and see what comes on up. Let me know. Email me.
Exquisite. Thank you so much. Exquisite, exquisite, exquisite. And Erbag Kumra, and many, many lovely Slanja blessings. Thank you.
Oh, welcome. Oh, enjoy the moon tonight. Divi, I see your hand there too, darling.
I just loved all this, and you're just delightful. I was wondering, I didn't know what do you have a class coming up? When is that, or what is that?
I've got through Leah. Oops, my sound has gone weird. Through Leah, I've got I'm doing double sound. I'm not sure why, but I've got, okay, thanks, that's better now. I've got the Tangled Wood coming up beginning in October. So that's early October. Let me check that up, and I'll tell you. It is beginning October 13 in America and October 14 in Australia. So it will be 5 to 7 p.m. PST time, and it is 10 till 12 Australia time.
2 hours?
2 hours, yes. And that will be going up soon. No, I don't know why that's just not going to. Anyone know how to put PDFs into a chat box? No, it's not happening. Okay. No. Okay, and yep, we'll let you know about that. So we need to wind up, you beautiful ones. So enjoy the stories and be prepared for how they will reach out and touch you. It doesn't matter that you might not know what story to run with. It will know you. So see which ones, it's almost literally like they reach out and touch you and then hold you. So let me know what comes up for you. And it's just been an absolute pleasure to see you all these new beloveds. Thank you so much for coming and for your intention and enthusiasm. And thank you for all the stories that you hold. Yeah. Have a beautiful rest of your day or evening. And I'll see you again. Okay.
Very soon.
Thank you, Jacqui.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.